Hello, this is Chris Mitchell. Today I want to talk to you about how to change fuel filters on a Ram 3500, specifically the 2014 model year for the diesels. Now, gasoline motors do have fuel filters, but they don't have to be changed nearly as often as you have to change the diesel fuel filter. The first thing we must do is locate the fuel filters. There are two. The first filter is on the driver's side of the engine underneath quite a bit of material. The second filter is actually under the passenger side bed of the truck. Next, we must determine the tools we need for the job and find a clean place to work. I set up a table and placed my new filters and all the tools I needed on a clean work table. It is most important that one put a blanket over the fender to prevent scratching the truck and cover the exposed battery leads, or take the time to disconnect the negative lead from both batteries. And one must find a suitable ladder to get to the top of the engine to work. So first let's talk about the front engine filter. Beside this filter is a yellow drain knob that one can either turn counterclockwise to drain with either their hand or a large Phillips head screwdriver. Before doing so, one will want to place a drip pan under the truck. I found that extending the tubing on the drain hose located just above the front axle prevented splatter on the axle and on the ground. I used some 3/8 tubing I had, extended the tubing, and put it in my drip pan. The most difficult part of this job is getting the lid off the front engine filter. I tried a 1/2-inch socket wrench with a 1 1/8 inch socket attached, but I could not turn it. I then tried hooking up an air wrench to this instead, and it still would not turn. I do not recommend using an air wrench, but I could not turn this by hand, and I was trying to find a way to get this loose. Again, this was the most difficult. I finally rigged up 2 long extensions with a universal joint to reach this socket on top of the filter. I used my 1/2-inch ratchet socket wrench and a long pipe for leverage. Caution, this top lid is plastic and they can break, so why am I having to use pipe for leverage? This is my first time changing the filter on this truck after 20,000 miles, and the truck is 2 years old. So maybe the lid was frozen from the heat, or maybe it was torqued down too tight at the factory. I don't know. But if one uses a pipe like this on the end of the wrench, then the lid might just break. So we turned the pipe very carefully, very slowly, counterclockwise, and the lid popped and jumped. Instead of the lid coming off smoothly, it would actually skip. It would just pop. So with each movement of the pipe, the lid would catch and jump until we finally got it loose enough where it gently came off by hand. I've noticed by looking at some of the other YouTube videos out here, people show you that, hey, I've got the lid loose and now I'm taking it off. They don't show you how they took it off. So I'm showing you how I took the top lid off of this front engine filter. A little unconventional, do it at your own risk, or take it to the dealer and let the dealer charge you $400 to do it. By far, this was the most difficult activity of changing the filters. Now that I know what to do, it will not take me near as long the next time I do it. After getting the lid off, then we pulled the filter out of the cartridge and removed the O-ring from the canister. The O-ring was difficult to see as it was black. Some of these O-rings are white, but mine was black, and when I first looked down there, it was very difficult to tell whether it even had an O-ring or not, but I knew it should have an O-ring, otherwise it would be leaking air. So we removed the old O-ring and replaced it with a lubricated O-ring. Took just a little bit of motor oil and lubricated the O-ring and put it back over the threads of the canister. Next, we pushed the new filter back into place. The second most difficult task was getting the lid back on this front engine filter. One must use a twisting motion while pressing down to seat the filter into the canister before putting the lid back on. Otherwise, you will never contact the threads. I had to play with this longer than I care to admit, and then I was able to thread the lid back on by hand. I used just my 1/2 inch socket wrench with a 1 1/8 inch socket to tighten the lid, being careful not to crack the lid. I did not use a pipe to retighten this lid. I tightened it by hand. As the lid got tighter, it started that popping and jumping sound again. I just turned it snugly with the wrench until I was sure the lid had made great contact with the new O-ring we just placed over the threads. The idea here is you want to get the lid tight enough that it contacts the O-ring and prevents air entrainment into the filter canister. Once we got the lid on, we closed the yellow drain valve with a Phillips head screwdriver and then removed the tubing extension that we used to catch the drain diesel fuel. Next, we hooked up our extended tubing to the black filter drainage nipple and the back filter drainage nipple, which in my case happened to be black as well, and turned that counterclockwise and drained the diesel from the rear filter. Next, we located the sensor plug and pushed down on the tab while wiggling the plug gently back and forth with a firm pull which disconnected the plug. I found that a normal size oil filter wrench was not big enough for this filter. Fortunately, I had a chain oil filter wrench that would fit well. I also had a strap wrench. My recommendation to you if you're doing this the first time is that once you buy this filter for the back of the truck, then find a filter wrench that actually fits the filter. This filter was on tight and took quite a lot of pulling to get it loose, but it was not near as tight as the front filter. Nothing on these filters are reverse threads, so counterclockwise turns to open drain valves or to remove filters or canister lids. Do not turn clockwise to tighten, otherwise you'll tear something up. So clockwise turns to tighten the lids, filters, and shut drainage valves. I say this because in some applications you might run into things that have reverse threads on them. Next, I removed the sensor from the old filter using a pair of large channel lock pliers. Once I had the sensor out, I put it on the new filter after replacing the sensor O-ring that came with the new filter. Again, I put a little bit of oil on the new O-ring on the face of the filter, the large thick O-ring, and screwed the filter back on as tight as I could with my hand. Next, I put my filter wrench back on it and turned it 1/8 to 1/4 turn to make sure it was snug. Once this was done, I reconnected the sensor plug and turned the drain clockwise to ensure the drain and nipple were closed. I then removed the drainage line from the sensor nipple and appropriately discarded the diesel I collected in accordance with local laws. Once I had both filters back in place, I then cycled my truck on and off and listened for the fuel pump cutting on, filling up the empty filters. RAM warns that these filters should not be pre-filled with diesel. We put the filters on empty, which means before the truck will run again, the filters must be filled by the fuel pump from cycling the ignition switch on and off. To fill the filters, I turned my truck on again and off again. Note, I did not engage the starter. I turned the key to the on position, listened for the fuel pump to cycle, then turned the key off when I heard the fuel pump cut off. I repeated this on again, off again several times, then tried to crank my truck. The first time it did not crank, so I went back to cycling the key on and off again to fill the filters. I then tried cranking the second time and the engine cranked fine and the truck ran fine. Before I changed these filters, I noticed the truck was not very responsive. This is typically what happens when you let filters go a little bit longer than what you should. Once I changed the fuel filters, the truck, again, it ran great. I have attached a PDF file to this video of the tools I used and the procedure I followed. If anyone wants it, then just look below and feel free to use at your own risk. Again, the hardest part was finding a setup to get the lid off the engine fuel filter the first time. Here's a picture of what I used. Just remember that if one uses a breaker bar or pipe extension on the tool, then you can crack the top of the filter. In this case, I had no choice. It would not budge. The dealership is charging around $400 to change these filters. The first time is rough, and maybe that's why. The filters I purchased at the local O'Reilly Auto Parts The front filter, I believe, was a little over $20. The rear filter was around $50. These filters were originally, I believe, sold by Ram for $250. So of their $400 charge, about $200 of it's filters and $200 is labor. But as time has passed, Ram has come down on their filters, but they are still way more at the dealership than the parts house. Don't forget to view my PDF file attached to this video. In that file, I detail tools needed, preparation, procedures, and cleanup. Appreciate you watching the video. Please leave comments below. Thank you.